was an amazing collaboration, but it was interesting because it's this Japanese flower arranging school, Ikebana School in Tokyo.
It's very Japanese.
But
We're going to sit on one side. Do you have a preference?
Seems like you want the left, I mean the right, whatever word, it doesn't matter, I don't care.
And I'm going. You give yours to Tess after.
Okay. You guys will share? Hello, hello.
No, we're going to have to pass the mic. We're on a budget. I don't think you have water.
Okay. Yeah, they're there, and I'll pass them. Hi, Kate. Is that the bat signal? Okay, I think I just got the bat signal. Can everyone hear me? Welcome. My name is Jessica May, and I am very proud to work both for the Trustees and the Decortiva. We are so glad you are here tonight, and you will notice that I am not an ArtsEmerson or an Emerson College employee. I am a proud guest on this site. And I just want to start the evening by acknowledging that in many ways we are all guests, as we are on unceded territory of the Pawtucket, the Massachusetts, and the Wampanoag tribe. We're not going to do a formal land acknowledgement tonight because part of the conversation that we'll have is so deeply invested in really the concept of land and what it means to be of, from, and connected to land. But I do want to note that not only are we on this unceded territory, but we're really right across the street from the Boston Common, which is a site of such extraordinary historical resonance in the United States, and a site of contested legacy. So we'll just have a moment of observation about that and say, despite this sobering start to the evening, how incredibly honored and joyful I am to be here for this project, Adam Silverman Common Ground, the Trustees, Decortiva, Sculpture Park and Museum, many of you may have heard of it, and ArtsEmerson, along with the Emerson College Office of the Arts, have joined together not only to host this evening, to host the installation of art in the windows that you saw as you were coming in, and I hope you'll take a second good look at as you leave this evening, I'm sure you will, but also to complete this project with dinners, because in fact this project is only completed by its participants through conversation, through the breaking of bread. So we have bread tonight. We hope you'll have a snack. We hope you'll have a conversation as we finish up the conversation with the group tonight. On the trustees team, I want to just acknowledge and thank the extraordinary Molly Armstrong, who is here, who has run this project and logistics. She has good comrades and colleagues in Ross Normandin, Clarissa Fostel, Sarah Montross, Tess Lukey, and the amazing Lindsay Parker. But on On the ArtsEmerson side, I want to acknowledge, David, your comradeship, your partnership, your kind friendship through this whole process. I want to acknowledge our partner, Ronnie Pinoy, who couldn't be here tonight because she's not feeling well, so we'll send her some good wishes. Kevin Becerra, who is our producer tonight, the wonderful folks who take care of this place, who built those incredible walls, the students who are here, part of the communications team, who are making this visible to audiences far and wide. And we sincerely welcome all of you who are with us digitally, as well as those of you who are with us in person. We're thankful that you're here. I have to change this because it's after 7, my brain is starting to float away, and I don't want to miss anything. I think that this group will sort of talk about dinners as an integral part of this project, so I am going to move to an introduction of our esteemed guests, Adam Silverman, the artist of Common Ground, and Tess Lukey, the Trustees Associate Curator of Native American Art. Adam comes to us from both Los Angeles and Rhode Island, where he lives in Los Angeles, has a home in Rhode Island, and is in fact a graduate of RISD. So I like to think of you as like truly a New Englander, really. Adam describes the work of ceramics as being a gambler's art, and it's one of the questions that I'll want to bring to you because I think the role of chance is such an interesting part of this project as well as your artistic practice. Adam has a long history as a ceramicist, as a teacher, as an artist whose work with glazes and these kind of extraordinary, beautiful forms has been remarked upon and valued by audiences throughout the country and indeed the world. His work is collected widely, and Adam is known as a true collaborator. So for a 400 plus project called Boolean Valley, he worked with the architect Nedar Tarani, who has worked with you for years now on this project. No? No? Okay. You'll correct me.
We collaborated on that project, and it also sort of traveled around.
It traveled.
It's been in the National Sculpture Center. Oh, sorry.
In Dallas.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Is that better?
At the National Sculpture Center
At the
in
National
Dallas.
Sculpture Center in Dallas, where it's lived for the last decade or so.
So what's wonderful about that emendation is that will characterize in some ways the spirit of our conversation this evening, of just sharing. I've also completely obsessed with the Common Ground Project because in 2019, 2020, and particularly as the pandemic was getting going, Adam reached out to friends, colleagues, people you knew, and in some cases people you didn't know from all over the United States as well as 6 territories. And I think I'd love for you guys to talk about what it means to think about what is the boundary of the United States, and invited collaborators to send materials that would become the materials of the Common Ground Project. So Adam is joined this evening with my beloved colleague, Tess Lukey, the Trustees Associate Curator of Native American Art. Tess is a ceramicist herself and a graduate of Mass Art. She is also a esteemed art historian and graduate of master's program at the University of New Mexico. Tess brings to the trustees not only a spirit of unbelievable possibility and deep thoughtfulness, a kind of can-do that, boy, we are thankful for, but also the ability to pull off projects large and small. So she is currently in the process of a very large project of reinstalling the trustees' collection of Native American art at Fruitlands Museum, which will debut next year. She's just opened her first collection show at Fruitlands, Beauty and Usefulness, and next year she will also debut a major contemporary video art installation at Fruitlands, as well as a project with the Ojibwe artist Andrea Carlson this like next week, not this fall, this kind of in this immediate season. I think Tess, it will also behoove everyone to know, is a fan favorite when it comes to curatorial spotlight talks. So together, under David's moderatorship and kind intellectual generosity this evening, this group will bring us into that kind of promise of conversation, which is the only way we can really bridge difference in our culture. And that conversation comes from a place of thoughtfulness, consideration, knowledge, and curiosity. And so I'm grateful to be here with you all. I'm grateful for this partnership between the trustees and ArtsEmerson. And I'm grateful to all of you for making this part of your evening and your week. I know it's a commitment, and we are so honored you're here. Turn it over to you, Tess.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm just going to offer, for all the names that Jessica lifted, I offer my thanks as well, and also extend that thanks to you for joining us this evening. I'm going to jump right in. We have a lot to say. I'll give you a little bit of the context of how these conversations happen. We're having a conversation. This is not a panel, this is not a performance. We're literally going to continue a conversation that we had, just a few minutes ago, but also over the phone over the last few weeks. And we'll have that conversation for the first 40 minutes. I don't know, Kevin, I need you to be over here because I can't see you because I keep going like this to see when I get my cue. Okay, thank you.
I can flag you.
Very good. We've got a little mirroring happening. Thank you. We'll spend maybe 30, 45 minutes in conversation, and then we will open it up for a larger discussion with you. We also have many people who are watching us on the live stream, and again, thanks to our colleagues at Emerson and the many incredible students who are making that possible. So we begin. Tess and Adam, it's really a pleasure to be with you again today. I just have to share a quick story. I encountered Adam's work in Rhode Island at the RISD School of RISD, and when they were talking about the work, we were at the inauguration of a dear friend of ours who's becoming president. She was like, you need to know this person, and I was so glad. So shout out to Crystal Williams, the president there, for bringing us together. And Tess and I had an opportunity to encounter each other very briefly at an incredible gala event at the De Cordova. I don't know when that was, like in the spring, but it was beautiful. And so it's nice to be in this conversation. Today we're really talking about how the land nourishes us and holds our history. And we all have complex relationships, particularly, some communities with the land, the dispossession, the extraction of the land, the unkind attention that we've paid to the land. But maybe we start with a place of just hearing from each of us, because I'm like moderating, but I'm also in the conversation, just so pretend, sort of what land meant to you as a child and how that's evolved now. And I can just start by saying, like, for me, there's a difference between land and nature, right? So when I think about land, I think about digging holes in my grandmother's backyard. I don't know why we did this. People pay lots of money for these lawns. We would dig holes. We were committed to building an underground clubhouse. And I remember just having hands in the soil, twigs and limbs, and that was such a visceral, sort of a very important moment of being so close to land. And then I think about my children now who I don't even know, they don't know what dirt is, actually. So we've come so far from that proximity, from that depth, but when I think about the meaning of the earth and I think about what the earth holds, it's quite visceral. But that's kind of my first memory when I think about land and my childhood.
I can share a little bit about land first to start us off. Land is a really interesting thing for me because I'm a ceramicist. I've always been playing with mud my whole life. My mom will tell you I lived with dirt all over me. Like, I loved to be outside. But the story I want to share is actually more recent because I think that the things that happened to me when I was younger were important in terms of forming my identity and my relationship to place. But for me, when I think about my relationship to land, it's much more focused on the now than what happened to me when I was young. And when you think about like your relationship with the land and nurturing it and giving it back and being a part of it in some ways, having that land under your nails and that feeling of the soil and of the, when it rains, the petrichor, that smell, all of those sensations. I was at a point in my life prior to being at the Trustees where I needed to be back with the land. I had lost that relationship. And I had the chance to be at this wonderful job that put me literally in conversation with the land every day because I was growing vegetables for a living. And it was a completely like 180 from what I had been doing before, but it brought me back to those young childhood experiences that developed my identity in the first place. And I realized who I was and my relationship with that land and how foundational when I was young, how important it was to forming who I am now. And those experiences I come back to, and I need them. I mean, I've been making pottery since I was really young. I loved it. I mean, it was something that I realized that I wanted to go to school for, so much so that I got a degree in it. It is so important to reflect that also in my everyday, though. You know, I'm a ceramicist, but I'm also a curator, and so my relationship with the land is one both indigenous in my identity, you know, very focused on specific places, but also a lot more expansive and different in the way that I think about it as an artist versus a curator.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah, that works. I wasn't expecting this question, so I don't have a good articulate answer, but I think I do have a very close relationship to the land through work, whenever I travel, I will always collect earth from wherever I am and bring it back to my studio and try to make something out of it. And it's a way of connecting to a place when I travel, feeling like, you know, buying vegetables at the local farmers market and cooking with them. But mostly for me, my relationship to the land that feels the most meaningful throughout my entire life is where the land and the ocean meet.
Absolutely.
And when the fact that you can go there 2 or 3 times a day and it's completely different and it erases itself in the morning and it erases itself again at the end of the day, and you can make marks and you can find something different. It feels like the most sort of fertile, metaphorically and literally, place for me for my entire life.
Yeah, one of the places that comes to mind being that very visceral experience is up in Maine at Haystack, where there's clay deposits right on the beach side. And like, talk about an amazing example of how the world changes and the land changes when it's interacting with different things like the ocean. New Mexico used to be an ocean. That land in some ways was where water meets land. It's that same experience, just a lot older. I mean, there's those experiences all over the place.
You know, you mentioned sort of the haystack and these waster piles, and I think a lot about what the earth holds. In many ways, both of you are ceramicists. You are, in this project, Common Ground, you're actually taking, you know, parts and making whole, putting stories back together, creating new stories. And so I'd love to hear you talk about what that process was like, but I also want to, you know, trouble this notion of what land is, because again, it holds our histories, right? It holds the stories that we're proud of and the stories that we're not proud of. And I'm often reminded about, maybe some of you saw the MFA's show, Hear Me Now, which was an incredible show centered around Dave the Potter. And one of the contemporary artists, Adebumi Gadebo, talked about her contemporary practice, and she had brought earth from Edgefield, South Carolina, and put it in in the pedestal with the bonnet, and it started to fog up. You know, the fact that this earth is living, it is alive, and we treat it as if it's not there, and so our care for this earth has not been the same. And so you talked, Tess, as well about that land being alive, about the twigs and the trees and the limbs being very present, but many of us don't have that similar relationship. So I would love to hear you talk about that, maybe then Adam bring in your practice of, you know, this notion of taking the land from different parts and bringing it together to heal, bring back stories, and if that was your intention, yeah. I'm going to have you share.
Yeah, we'll share, okay.
Yeah, because I need to control things.
Oh, okay, I see.
Yeah.
Do you want to start first? Okay. I've chatted with David before about this, and I think it's a really important thing to talk about is when you talk about pots, when you talk about ceramics, you talk about them in relationship to the body. You talk about the shoulder, you talk about the belly, you talk about the neck. They're very human. And that's not just the only part of them that is that way, and that you should think of them that way. They have a living, breathing soul. You know, when you were talking about how they took the soil and they put it in a bonnet and it continued to sweat, it continued to grow. Well, those pots still have that life within them, regardless of whether they've been fired or not. They still have that soul, and so they should be treated in that way. It's a very indigenous concept, honestly. When you're in the Southwest, they talk about the firing process, the pots gaining blush. They have blushing on them when they have a smoke mark on their side. And so it's all very, very human. It's all very grounded in kind of our physical realities as well. But they're living, breathing beings, and I think it's important to honor that when you're making, but also when you're showing work. And when I make work, I'm the same way. I have had the privilege to work with clays from across the United States, both in the Southwest and up here, and some from my own territory. And every time I use it, it feels like I'm a part of that place again. And it is such an honor for me to have that connection. I feel like it's one that not everyone experiences as a ceramicist, and I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world.
Maybe, Jessica, I'm going to hand these to you. I think I'll use this just as an opportunity to quickly describe the project of the pots in the window. And I brought a couple of props that Jessica's going to hand out, which is, so essentially the idea of this project, which is very simple and quite literal, was to collect, well, let me just take a step back. The way I thought about it is if you look at the country or the planet from above, from space or God's eye view or whatever way you want to think of it, in my mind, the three things that you see are the blues of the water, the greens of the vegetation, and the browns of the earth or the soil. So the idea was to collect samples of each of these three materials from every state, US state, and territory, meaning Puerto Rico, Guam, DC, et cetera. And think about the country as a single place rather than 56 divided places. And this project began in the fall of 2019, sort of at the peak of or in the middle of the Trump presidency. So before George Floyd was murdered, before the pandemic, but still a time that felt to me so fraught with conflict that it's hard to imagine that it got worse, but somehow things did. In any case, so then the idea that I had was to combine each of those materials into a single material, to think about the country as a single place, not a place that's been divided. And each of those materials, each of these small amounts that came from each place has an infinite amount of life in it, and death in it, and narratives in it, and spirits in it, or whatever you want, whatever beliefs you have, all of those materials contain many things. And then when you combine them into a new single material, who knows what the relationships become, right? I mean, so then the idea was to make these works out of that material or use that material to make the work. So when you see the 56, so then 56 became the magic number instead of 50 states. But when you see the 56 pots there, all of those things are in there. All of those lives and deaths and spirits are in there in a way that I think, I mean, I can feel it, and I think, you know, some kids just walked by earlier and were calling somebody said like, oh, you got to check out these Shrek vases. So not everyone's seeing it necessarily, but anyway, I'm diverging. Well, let me say one more thing about the forms, related to what you said actually, because the way some people have asked me in the past, like, where did those shapes come from? And they are similarly not subtle. You know, the idea was when I was doing studies of what kind of shapes to make, first I thought it should be an egg or a sphere, some sort of pure rebirth kind of metaphor. And then I thought, well, if the idea of this project is to bring people together and listen, it should be an open form. And these handles are very reminiscent of ears, and they're sort of beaten up. You know, they've been through some stuff, but they're standing on a strong foot. So there is all of this sort of anatomical, metaphorical references as well.
Yeah. So one of the things I wanted to share was that when you think about your pots in particular, you know, they are very indicative of that place, but are in and of themselves that place. And I think that's a really interesting way to think about those pots, because people see them and they may not realize that that is from a very, very specific place and is made from that place, so it is that place. And when I make my own work in ceramics, when I do my work as a curator, I try to think that way about a lot of materials and a lot of things, in particular pots. when I use clay from the cliffs at Aquinnah, that is Aquinnah. I am making a pot with my homelands, with my people, with my history, with those narratives. And that clay in particular is where our people are actually derived from. So I'm, in a way, creating new life. And I think there's something beautiful in that and in your pots as well, because I think they kind of evoke that same feeling.
You're reminding me that who gets to tell the story is really important, right? So Adam, you've collected these three elements and made them from all these different places. But as you mentioned, Tess, each one of it has a piece of it, right? And we're standing on grounds that we did not steward, right? And we think about the responsibility to lift up those stories, who gets to tell the stories. We are working, this project, Common Ground, is in perfect balance with two other projects that we're working on. One is called We Are the Land, which opens in a couple of weeks, which is really the Wampanoag people telling their own stories about their relationship to the land, lands that they stewarded before any of us have come here. And so it's really interesting to think about the people, the owners of the land, and who gets to listen to that story and who is able to amplify that story. So I love that you're talking about when you make pottery that's from Aquinnah, it is Aquinnah pottery. And so this We Are the Land project gives us an opportunity to hear from the people that we don't often get to hear from, that we don't actually see as visible in our community. So I'm excited about that project. And I know when you talk about the complication of land, we are in a very urban environment, and you can forget, when you're walking on the concrete pavement, what it means to be connected to land. And Adam, I won't forget when you first came to look at the space and look at the site, you looked through the windows and you saw the cemetery, right? And your first thing is that you said it, well, not the first thing, but one of the things you said is, I'm so glad that these vessels are in conversation with the cemetery. And you also mentioned the cemetery, no, not the cemetery, but the common on which the cemetery sits as being a graveyard or dead or something you said. And I'd love for you to talk about the cognitive dissonance around it being alive and vibrant, but also being very dead, and what prompted you to say, I'm so glad that these vessels are in conversation. I was really surprised. I didn't know what you meant, actually. But this cemetery is in conversation. So just riff on that a little bit, but first maybe Tess, because we're talking about the land being alive, you being from the indigenous community, talking about the importance of that, but also we're standing on land that feels dead and feels like it has not served us as it should.
Well, one thing I do want to correct you is that we don't own the land, we steward it. We're as much in conversation with it as it is with us, and so it's not an ownership thing. It's a much more complex relationship with that, and I think that's where my comments of the common feels like a graveyard is because it's a place of ends and not beginnings for a lot of indigenous communities. And so while there is vibrancy in Adam's work and its conversation with that space is really interesting, and I can't wait to hear your comments on that, I think that space is so void of native presence that there's no other word to call it but dead. There's no other thing to call it but a graveyard because it's a place of ends, not beginnings. And that's where I think Boston is trying to do better things now in working with community members. They've got a long way to go, but I'm not going to sit here and just criticize because I think that there is some change happening. Boston Common would be a great place to see that change happen. I don't know that it ever will, but what an opportunity to have Adam's work in relationship to it and start that conversation.
Yeah, and as you're responding, I said earlier I live on the precipice of hope, so I'm hopeful because for us, many people, that narrative of, it is no longer alive because of what, there's no, it's beginning and no ending. I can't exactly, you said it so beautifully, but how do we bring life back to this land that people have seen as really a beautiful and place that they want to come? What does that require of us, and what responsibility as artists do we have in troubling that narrative and trying to create new narratives? So, in death, there's new life.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think my reaction when I was talking to you, whenever that was this summer, Well, first of all, I mean, there's sort of this simplistic interest and fascination in these very old cemeteries that they exist in cities and towns and in in Rhode Island, people have them in their yards. I mean, they show up in the strangest places, but so they're just something that interests me. But the pots, when I've arranged them in different locations and different contexts, sometimes they're horizontal in a long row, sometimes they're standing like this, sometimes they're more randomly placed, and they really can look like people or plants or a forest or a graveyard or any number of things where objects are often in some sort of patterned row. So just graphically, formally, I think there's a conversation happening. And then just what we talked about earlier, the notion that that place is obviously full of ghosts and all sorts of spirits, and these pots are as well, and who knows what conversation is happening there or not, but one can only imagine.
And is if you can continue, and Tess is certainly weigh in here, the responsibility of artists, right? Because actually you both are taking land from various places and as a medium. So what is your responsibility to caring for? We talk about being in right relationship with the land. How are you as artists thinking about your responsibility to be in right relationship with land as you are using it to tell new stories, create new narratives?
I mean, it's a complicated question, particularly if you're a potter and that's your material. So the question becomes, how do you use it? Do you use it with as much respect as you can? I mean, in my case, when it's materials that I've either collected myself or people have sent to me, there's a very personal connection. And every time, a lot of these materials came to me in like a U.S. Postal Service box from people around the country, and it was in the heart of the pandemic. And it was a really beautiful way of connecting, weirdly, because it was the only connection that I was having, or that some of them were having. And we were emailing and talking on the phone, and I sent everyone a piece of paper asking them what the source of each of the materials was specifically, and if it had any personal or cultural meaning to them. And some people just wrote nothing very interesting, and some people sent pages and photographs and poems and all sorts of stuff. So those materials, that earth, became actually a way of communicating and celebrating it as its own thing. And then as each one came to me, I tried to literally acknowledge it and thank it for being part of the project. I tasted every bit of water and ash and clay that I got, not too much, but
Tess is getting very excited about that.
You do? I mean, it's hard not to, but so I feel like, but at the same time, one could still be critical and say, yes, but you shouldn't be using it at all. But I think if you use it respectfully, then that's the best that I can do, and try not to waste it. But I'm also moving earth around the earth, which is not a very cool thing to do from an environmental standpoint.
Yeah.
My family thinks I'm a little nuts because I will taste every clay that I use, but there's something about knowing, really, really knowing your material in that way and connecting in that way. When I take clay, it's not really an extractive process in the same way that I think some other potters are, because I'm asking it if it's okay if I take it, and I'm thanking it, and I'm offering tobacco, and I'm not doing it lightly, especially when I take it from my own homelands. It is a very critical process, and I don't do it without extreme mindfulness. The same way when I was in New Mexico and I was working with clay from Pecos, we offered it ground corn as a thank you. And then we left no trace that we were there because we didn't want to. It wasn't about us being there. It wasn't about the process entirely. It was about that relationship that was formed, and then making sure that that relationship was maintained, both for the protection of the material and the land itself, but also to protect our relationship with that place. It's a give and take. All of my work is a give and take. I mean, Jessica mentioned something about chance. I mean, there's a lot of chance in going to harvest your own clay. There's a lot of chance in making pottery at every minute. It's something that you cannot always expect is going to happen the same way every time. For example, one of the very first times I ever went to grab clay from Aquina, I was there for powwow. I had totally forgotten all of my materials to gather clay, and I was like, when am I gonna do this? I have a plastic bag, and I think my sweatshirt, and if you've ever been to Aquinnah, you know it has like 4 different types of colored clays, and so I'm going, how do I keep them separate? The colors are gonna mix, I don't know what to do. Like, the type A person in me was like totally overwhelmed by the idea of the colors mixing. But I had this, I think it was a sweatshirt. We went down to the beach, and those are protected cliffs, so people can't harvest it. But, you know, if you've ever lived in New England, you've heard the stories about Aquinnah. It's a nude beach. Everyone covers themselves in clay. There's all these like terrible stories of people not respecting the land. But I was going there with that good intention, not in regalia, so no one knew I was from the community, besides the fact that my chairwoman had said, yeah, go get some clay, make some pots with it, it'll be great. And I get down to the beach, and I'm starting to pull pieces of clay from the cliffs. And a lady walks by me, and she's like, you're not supposed to take that. I whip out my tribal ID, and I was like, I'm a tribal member. I have permission. And it was like this moment of like extreme clarity about the fact that it's important to other people too. And that it's not just about me. And it's not just about what I'm doing, but it's so much more than that.
Yeah. One of the things that, you know, since the notion is not about me, I want to go back to the common because I'm from the South, and when I go on walks, I actually am trying to be one with the land, whatever that means. I actually think about what that earth is holding: the sweat, the blood, the tears, the anguish, the bones of my ancestors, right? Mm-hmm. And there are moments that it feels very much like it's a very spiritual experience, right? Being that close. When I walk down Boylston Street, right, we are so far removed with the levels of development and concrete from land. So how do we stay connected when the commons for many people is the only land, right? How do we stay connected and grounded to what it has provided for us in these urban settings? I mean, how do you think about connection to land in an urban environment?
Start looking at the history. Start being a little bit more responsible about where you're located. Think about your environment in its in a more holistic way. Like, I want people to seek out that information, that Boston has always been a melting pot, both for us now today, but also for indigenous communities. It was a place of coming and going. It was a place of meeting. Think more critically about where you are actually physically located and seek out those histories.
I don't have anything good to say. I just leave the city.
Well, that's one response.
I mean, I live in the heart of Los Angeles. It's so urban and hard, and then you just have to get out. I mean, that's all I do. One
of the things I loved about this project, many of you know at ArtsEmerson, our work is around bringing people together across difference. And we are not a museum. We don't do installations per se. But what I was so inspired by is this notion of solidarity, allyship, bringing many things together to make one. And the notion that we actually host dinners with the 56 place settings with people from different backgrounds. That was what we do. Like, that's what we do. We bring people together. And I bring and invite in another project that we're working on, which is the Black and Indigenous Initiatives, Black and Indigenous Futures, to talk about bringing Black scholars, artists, practitioners together to talk about those things that we hold in common and those things that keep us separated, and then think about what our future holds when we have Black and Indigenous leadership really leading the way. Because there was an article in the New York Times, probably everybody read it. There were the flooding that was happening up in somewhere in Canada, and finally someone realized, let's talk to the Indigenous community, figure out how to stop that. I mean, hello, right? Stewards of the land for how many years? And so this notion that the answers are already here. The answers are in the land. The answers are in the people, particularly these people who've been oppressed. And so but for me, it's like we all have some level of oppression. You know, the indigenous people, the people of the Black African diaspora. How we come together to make that happen. But it is that spirit of coming together that I think is going to take us to that next place. So I just invite that as a prompt for any ideas that brings up for you around the importance of thinking how these many different parts come together to actually take responsibility for leading us into our rightful future.
Well, maybe I'll just say something about sort of fill in. So the other part of this project that I worked on, which is not on display, which is what David referenced, is there is 56 plates, bowls, and cups as a separate thing. And the idea of the pots as well, but the plates, bowls, and cups have been more successful so far, was to use this project to bring people together who aren't ordinarily together. So to have meals around the country with 56 people who wouldn't ordinarily be together around an issue, whatever the issue was, it could be land. We've been trying to host meals in LA around homelessness, which is like the sort of preeminent issue of Los Angeles now, and have people from all perspectives on that at a table and use the narrative of the ceramics as sort of the first lubricant for the conversation, and then use the food and the narrative of the food as a cultural bridge between different people as well to get conversation going, and then move to the difficult thing that everyone's angry and has opinions about, but sort of lubricate everyone with a narrative of coming together through the ceramics and the food and a shared breaking bread experience. And I mean, we all know that is a tried and true way of people communicating is around food. That's why there are, government meals and Thanksgiving fights with your family and all of that stuff. Anyway, and the idea with the pots also was not that they would just be on display, but that they would be engaged in some sort of collaborative way to bring people together who wouldn't ordinarily be together and use them for some purpose.
I think there's a beauty to the fact that your work is not just meant to be seen, but to be used. I think a lot of art aches for human interaction. And when we were in COVID and museums were closed, I mean, you could feel those buildings ache for people to be there. You could feel that art ache for interaction and its need for that kind of love and admiration and constant engagement. I mean, those plates and those bowls, I feel so bad that they're in boxes because I want to be eating off of them, because that's what they're meant to do. They're meant to be as much in conversation with the people as the people are in conversation with one another. And I think that there's a beauty and hope in that. And I think that that's one thing that a lot of institutions and museums don't think about, is that the art needs you as much as you need it. And I think those pots over there need the constant interaction that they're getting in those windows. They're truly enlivened by that. And I think a lot of people can learn a lot of things from that kind of thought process.
Yeah. There's a poem by Maya Angelou. If anybody knows me, I always have to bring Maya Angelou into every conversation I have, so this is my moment. But in '93, she wrote the inaugural poem for Bill Clinton called On the Pulse of Morning, and it starts, a rock, a river, a tree. The poem goes on to talk about those as personifying voices to us, to think about as the rock, as the river, as the tree. We've abused these elements over time, and their warning is to us, until we figure out how to come together, we won't find out a unified future, right? And so much of the work that we do at ArtsEmerson is around connecting people for that rightful future. So I bring that poem up because she had got it all right all the time, in my opinion, but she really nailed it. It is really the land, and she named all the tribes, many of the tribes that actually were stewards of those lands, to invoke that in it, because again, it's so often not in our consciousness. And so this project actually, for me, Adam was saying as people walk by, he said, I hope people don't think this is like Pottery Barn or something as they're walking by. And I said, I don't care if they do think it's Pottery Barn, because it actually captures their attention. And my hope is that for 1 minute, they might ask what it is and be curious enough to come and read, to talk about the incredible work that you're doing. And that's, for me, why this project is really resonates for me as I walk by.
I completely agree with you. I think a lot of point of art is not necessarily for someone to get it, but to provoke thought, or to provoke engagement. And at this point, like, Okay, so he thought they were Shrek pots, but you know what? He stopped and he thought about them. He stopped and he thought, okay, what is this going on? I've never seen this before. Like, that's the point.
Yeah. This is the point. Very, very, very nice. Adam, is that what, I mean, this conversation, did you imagine conversation would be had as a result of your idea?
No, I mean, this project has been like an enormous gift to me, honestly. It's been 4 years, just about 4 years since I started it, and it has meandered. It has had different visions of itself over the course of its life. It's become much more focused in the last like year or so, but I had really no idea what I was getting into, and it's been a life-changing in a positive way.
Can I ask
not all
about
positive.
any pushback you've gotten? I know when I was talking about this white presenting man in this incredible project, a lot of people were like, what?
Yeah, no, I've definitely gotten pushback, no
Say
question. Well, I mean, I had one curator who said I had absolutely no right to make this project.
And what do you think they meant?
She said there is the blood of black and brown people in that soil you're using, and you have no right to use it.
Tess, I mean...
Well, my response was my people's blood is there too, and I'm using it respectfully, and I'm using it to bring us all together, so...
Did they present the work or no?
No, she didn't.
I don't know how I feel about that person, whoever they are, because I think that's... Well, the thing is that, like, okay, I get it. I get the perspective. I get it. Being of indigenous descent, being an enrolled member, like, I understand that it's important to acknowledge those histories, but this place, this United States, Turtle Island, was built on diversity of perspectives and people. And it is a home for so many people across time and space that to deny someone a seat at the table is just continuing the violence in another way. And so I don't think that's productive. And I don't think that is ever going to serve that person, or serve anyone for that matter, if you continue with that perspective.
And it's a narrative that we hear all over. Who gets to tell the story, right? And you know, when we've arrived, we are able to tell each other's story. In my opinion, when we understand each other and have made space, yes, there has been years where inequity and injustice and people have been marginalized, but there's something powerful about someone else being able to honor you by telling that story if it's done in right relationship. There's a project that, you know, I won't go into, that a presenter came and said, we want to do this project. And I said, have you talked to the people? No. I'm like, no, well, then we can't do this project until you go to talk to the people. They went back and talked to the people, and years later they came in and were like, oh, okay. Now, because it's important how you tell that story. So I figured, because even when I talked about bringing, one of the first questions is, who is the person, right? And that matters, because for too long, we have not heard people tell their own stories, which is why I'm so excited about We Are the Land, right? So you were going to...
Well, I mean, I think the thing about this project is this story is everyone's story and no one's story. It's not my story. I'm not presenting this as my narrative. I'm presenting this as a project to start a conversation and bring people together, just like we're doing right now. And just like, I mean, this is the 15th or so iteration of presenting this project, or more at this point, I don't even know. And every conversation's been different, and every crowd has been different. And I think I'm not the point of the project.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah. Kevin's looking at me. What am I supposed to do now? I'm supposed to say, now we're widening the conversation and invite any perspectives, questions. I would say, I speak for myself, I'm not an expert. I just have lots of questions, and I love living inside those questions. So feel free to, do we have a mic, or we're just going to shout out? I'm just going to repeat the questions after you say them, so say them loudly, please. So I'll open it up now. We have maybe 10 minutes or so for this. Jessica, were you raising your hand?
I was totally raising my hand, but I'm going to shut up because I have a lot to say. So if someone else wants ready to go.
No, kick us off.
Okay. So first, I think one of
No, I mean, it's been interesting because, yes, that I've encountered that many times. I mean, what's happened for me with this project, which was a little bit surprising, is I sort of put it out into the world and was, well, let me just say one other part of the reality of the project was I have a partner on the food side of it who's a foodways scholar who has been very instrumental in organizing a lot of the meals. And he and I together applied for a bunch of grants, and the idea was that we would really program like 10 locations around the country for different reasons, not, like New York, Chicago, LA, places that had, we did all these drawings of maps and overlaid maps to try to find places that were sort of, had layered issues that made them a ripe place to have a meal. So like for example, El Paso rose to the top way above other places in Texas because there's all sorts of issues with immigration, there's mass shootings there, there's just all of these things, contemporary and historical, that made it seem like an interesting place to have a meal. We got rejected by all of the grants, which is a whole other conversation we could have. So we've been piecemealing it, and the people who have responded in the piecemeal scenario is mostly museums. So it's been mostly the art context, and also like one curator will tell another curator, so it becomes, and then the museum people are super enthusiastic until we get to that moment where they're like, wait a second, the registrar just held up a stop sign, or, so it's been very interesting to sort of navigate that. The secret weapon of museums that allows you to touch things is the education department. So I've been doing most of the programming with education departments so that people are allowed to touch the stuff. And I just have to sign waivers saying I don't care if it breaks, because otherwise no one will take it. And we've done probably 10 or 15 meals, and we've only had one plate break. People are incredibly respectful. Everyone knows the narrative. Everyone knows what they're using. I made the stuff strong and heavy, knowing it was going to travel. But people always ask me those questions, like, oh, you live in LA, or what do you do about earthquakes with your work? Or you've got a lot of kids, what about your work? I mean, nothing ever breaks. It's stuff just doesn't break like people worry about. They worry about it so much more than they should.
We're actually hosting one of the dinners for our Black and Indigenous, so these are Black, Indigenous, and Afro-Indigenous artist scholars who are coming together next week. So let's pray that nothing ever breaks. So we'll be, and I know exactly, let's hope that we don't, but it is a really, yeah, right. It is really beautiful to be able to see and observe beauty, but then also have this functionality, which makes it very, very real. So thank you for granting that to us.
I can tell you, as an artist and someone who's very obsessed with materials, I always want to touch art. Like, I always do. It's really hard for me not to, and I don't in museums. Like, I respect it, but the fact that I get to work with objects every day, hands-on, like, is like my dream. But when I worked for the Society of Arts and Crafts when I was in like my very infancy, it was a gallery that was based on touch. Like, you interacted with a lot of the art that was in there. Probably because it was framed under the craft designation, but we won't get into that talk today. But I think there's something like really wonderful about that. You got to touch it. I've always wanted to touch art in museums, and so those experiences are the things that I always crave. And when I was working with the MFA, it was like the biggest like deal that there were ceramics unbonneted. So like, I understand, like, it's a big deal when you're thinking about art in a completely different way, because it's not art with a capital A, it's meant to be used.
And I just have to give a shout out to our general management team, because I cannot tell you how many emails were sent around who washes the dishes, where do they get washed, who takes them to the dishwasher, who has to observe when they're washed. I'm like, oh my gosh, we're just going to send them back dirty. This is what we're going to do. But we're not going to do that. We're going to wash them. We have a whole protocol for that, but it is a gift. Other questions? Yes, Abigail.
Park in South LA called Magic Johnson Park. And it was a meal that was hosted by the LACMA Education Department. And they've been programming in Magic Johnson Park, and they're ultimately going to build a building there in probably the next decade, although David Adjaye was supposed to design it, so that's another story. But anyway, so they've been doing programming, and they've been working with a bunch of local community groups from different arenas. And so it was a meal for leaders of these different groups in the community, some food-based things, farms, design, urban design studios, and just LACMA sort of offering this meal as a way of facilitating conversation between some of these people didn't know each other and didn't know LACMA and the education department. So it was great, and it was an amazingly delicious meal. They just broke. Oh no, so there's no separate states. The idea of the project is that all of the materials are mixed together and all of the plates represent the entire country. So there's no way to know. A little bit of everyone broke, yeah.
And then my next question is, you as the artist, obviously conceptualize the thing, build the thing, outreach the thing, go out, and the hosts are putting together these groups for these meals. Is part of your practice to then design, what are they talking about?
No, it's not at all. I mean, and sometimes they've wanted me to, they're like, okay, we want to do this, what should we talk about, or who should come? And then I always just push it back and say, I don't even need to be there, and I'm not there always. It's whatever they want. It's whatever, this stuff is there in service of their mission, whatever their mission is. And if they don't have a mission, then they shouldn't do it, or they should figure something out to do, sort of like that sort of what happened with that LACMA meal, where it started with like, it's going to be a community outreach, but what does that mean? Who's at the table? I mean, once you start saying like literally who gets a seat at the table, it becomes much more real.
Other questions? Yes.
How has the project evolved as these conversations have been happening? There is a wonderful mix of all the different states to create sort of an amalgamation of interaction for all of these people. From where you started to maybe where you are and where you're going forward, how has that path evolved?
I mean, it's evolved slowly, and there have been like small things, and then some sort of big decisions were made along the way. So the project was, since we'd got no grants, it's been like sort of self-funded, or people give us a little money and then we do a meal, that kind of thing. So at one point I thought, well, maybe I'll sell the pots to fund the meals. And then I thought, oh, maybe I'll sell one pot per state, or some, I was trying to figure out ways to raise money. And then I just realized, like, the pots need to stay together. The whole project needs to stay together. The pots look, and I at one point I was talking with this great program called Art and Embassies. It's a DC-based program, and we were talking about, well, maybe the pots will go to 56 embassies as ambassadors of this notion, but they're much less interesting once they're separated. They just look much stronger together. So, and the message is much stronger, because then you can see, the idea that they have essentially the same biological DNA, but they're complete individuals. It's as a metaphor that we have much more in common than we do in difference. You need to see them all together. You can't just say it and show one pot. So then the decision became it needs to stay together. And then at one point I stopped like hustling meals, and I started trying to hustle a partner. Like, I need somebody to help me with this project because it's killing me. And I'm still trying to be an artist and do other projects. So I have found an incredible partner, and the transition is occurring, which is an organization in Los Angeles called the Skirball Cultural Center, which is a non-religious or a secular Jewish organization that has a museum. And their mission and the words that they use in like when you go to their buildings and you see the words that are carved in the walls, it's basically like half of the same words I use talking about the project. The alignment was really incredible, and their leadership embraced the project enormously. And so what's gonna happen is we're doing a bunch of meals. It's working its way back west. And then it's going to go into residence there for a year, where it's going to be permanently out on the floor, not in storage, and then meals will be hosted regularly, and it'll come out of the cases and be used, and then it'll go back in the cases. And then they're going to start traveling it. And so they're sort of picking up the mantle with much more infrastructure than I have, and much smarter, more motivated people, and not just me and my buddy Scott. So they're the new stewards, which is great.
With the idea that, as you said, they'll keep going out. Yeah.
It's like a new begin. It's like
Yeah.
being born again.
That's the evolution. So it continues.
There's also some beauty in the fact that you've worked with other like collaborators on this project in a way, other artists.
You mean in terms of meals and?
Well, no, I mean, I'm thinking about the flower arrangements that you did. I think that's, and you should probably tell the people about that.
That will continue as well, yeah. So, I mean, as I said earlier, like the idea is that the pots would also be used collaboratively, but the problem, of course, is that everyone knows how to use a plate bowl and a cup collaboratively, but saying to somebody, like, if you have any idea for 56 pots that's interesting, let me know, which is what I keep saying to people. And so far the only actual use that has happened, and I have a little book here that you're welcome to look at, is I did a collaboration last spring, with a Japanese flower arranging school in Los Angeles, Ikebana School, and that's a really interesting / obvious thing to do. But these people are all artists. Most of the people who participated in it were either instructors in the school or advanced students, and they really take their art as seriously as I take mine. And so each one of those was a collaboration. So there really were 56 collaborations there. And then it turned out so nicely that we made this catalog after the fact. But we're looking if anyone has any ideas for 56 pots that's not just sticking flowers in them. It is interesting, and it's a loaded subject for me because I'm Jewish and I'm a secular Jew, and it's an identity quandary for me, being an American Jew as part of a long 2,000-year diaspora, and so in a way, selfishly, it is also a way for me to think about those issues more head on and not sort of avoid them, which I've spent the last 60 years doing. I grew up in Connecticut in the suburbs, the only Jews in town, so it is interesting.
And there's also the notion, you use a superlative most, right? And which is complicated, right? And which is why we sit in conversation, which is why we're bringing the Black and Indigenous communities together, because it's often this like one is greater than the other, right? And so I tend not to use the superlatives because of what it invokes, the trauma that it brings up, the reactions, which also is often a barrier to the conversation, right? So we all have had oppressions and things that have happened in various communities, and I think there's some similar things that we can live in that we focus on versus like which one is greater. The oppression Olympics, it happens all the time. It just doesn't advance the conversation in any way. But no, it's an interesting, and I'm thrilled that it has a home and it can actually move and stewards so you don't have to like do all that work yourself.
I've been washing the dishes myself.
Yes, I know. I've been to Adam's studio, which is gorgeous, by the way, and very clean. Rose, you had a question. Yeah.
I very much am comfortable in returning things, and I'm very much for that. But it's a complicated thing because some of those objects were forcibly taken, some of them were looted, some of them were given away for various circumstances. Some of them were given freely. I think a lot of museums are very complicated, and you can't look at them with one note towards everything needing to be returned, because I think if we're going to be in a conversation about voices and about people being at the table and representation, then you do at least need to have some sort of representation somewhere in some form. I disagree with you, though, about this nation being born in diversity, because each tribal nation is diverse. Each people that was living on this land prior to what the United States is today was diverse and is diverse. And so I think it is built on diversity. And I think if you think about it in that way, and you think about the various representations in museums, I don't agree with all museum politics. I never will. But I would rather work within them to build change and to offer spaces for those that have not traditionally been at the table. I mean, I'm a Wampanoag. I'm from Martha's Vineyard. Up until I being at the MFA, they had absolutely nothing from a Wampanoag community in their collections. And I stewarded some works into their collection that was from that. And so they're on view. And now we have representation and we have a voice in a gallery that we historically have been void of. And so I think there's opportunities. When there is a large amount of engagement, there's a lot of collaboration, there's a lot of consultation, there's a lot of thought and communication, that representation can be as diverse as it possibly can be. And I realize that there's always been hard inroads for Black and brown people. I realize that there has been systematic violence and systematic erasure. I mean, I live that even in my own white passing persona. I have to deal with it within my own community. There are people that discriminate against me in my own tribe because I'm too light-skinned. And so I've faced that, and I recognize that, but I think that there's more to it than just it's this color, this color, this color. And I think that's where your conversation about and your convening that's going to be happening is about a collective. It's about being together. It's about finding solutions rather than advancing the problems.
And it's a very challenging conversation because we own these histories, these traumas so deeply,
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
And for so many years have not been seen. And when you're trying to be seen in community with others who haven't been seen, it becomes very challenging. But again, if we don't get into the room and have the conversations, we'll never go there. And so this conversations like these are the ones that we love to have at ArtsEmerson. So we talk a lot about, people know us as a theater organization, and we are, but what's on stage is really the prompt, is what we talk about, and this is the point, to understand in all of its complexities, how we as humans need to learn, have to learn for our survival to come together with our differences and
Absolutely.
in spite of those differences. And so this project, is imagines what that could be for us by bringing all these pieces of earth, water, land together in this space. And so I'm just thanking all of you for being in this conversation with us, and my hope is that you will not only have an opportunity to put your hands in the soil, but as you do, to think about what histories need to be unearthed and what your role is in telling these stories over and over, because there is a counter-narrative that is trying to continue to erase this story. So I want to just offer my thanks both to Adam for conceiving this project, for allowing us to tell this story in Boston through the vessels, but also to Tess, the incredible work that you're doing, the scholarship, the experiences you bring to this conversation and to this community is extraordinary. I want to thank Jessica and the Cordova, because, I mean, when you look for a partner, you can't get any better than the folks at the Cordova. And I don't say, I mean, we worked with a lot of people, but this one was really easy, very cordial, and we had a shared vision, and we will continue to work together. And to our ArtsEmerson team, Kevin is here, and Robert is here, and Rebecca is here, Jack is here. Shameless plug. This is one of many projects. We've got Common Ground. We're also doing We Are the Land. It is going to sell out, which tells us something about these indigenous stories. right? People are hungry for them. So if you haven't gotten your ticket, you want to get your ticket. And also we have this Black and Indigenous convening, which is for Black, Indigenous, and Afro-Indigenous. But there are 2 panels that will be live streamed. And perhaps we can send that information to you after that so that you can tune into that. But if nothing else, continue the conversation. We have this space for a few more minutes. So there's plenty of cheese and other things over there. I don't know whether it's wine or if that's champagne or just sparkling water. They're teasing us. Sparkling cider, even better. So don't go crazy over there. But again, thank you for joining us for The Point. We will have more conversations to come. Always wonderful to see you. And thank you again for sharing time with us.